sprinting to get to the finish line. So you've been waiting for a while for this guy who just goes on and on to talk about India rather than other parts of the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about India, and maybe you can help me by saying whether you think the findings that we have for our India study are valid or not. Then I'm going to talk a bit about policy options, and then what I want to do is open it up to a broad discussion based on the exercise you carried out, the tutorial on day 2, in which you looked at the range of options available to communities beyond mobility, but including mobility, to address the challenge of climate change and climate impacts. So that's the breakdown of my presentation. And I'm going to sit over here a little bit so that I can also see the screen. So the context of this study is an award that Fabien Cotier was awarded. I was involved in it early on. Now I'll be the PI because Fabien's moving to Geneva. So the original project is called Displaced Livelihoods. And we're focusing on drought impacts on agricultural labor force participation in UP and Bihar. So the team involves a number of researchers, one of whom was a former postdoc visiting with us, Robin van Dijn, who's now at the University of Amsterdam. He would probably be the one who has the deepest experience working in India of the team, other than, of course, Chetan Chaitani, who is Indian, and of course he has very deep experience. So we know that the ag sector is exposed to extreme heat. And if stressors are, the climate stressors are drivers to rural-urban migration in India, that increases the urbanization rates and potentially also could contribute to the formation of slums or the growth of slums and informal settlements. So in India, there's approximately 150 households that are agricultural, that if you take an average household size, that's about 600 million people. So you remember I showed the urbanization rate in India, and it's among the lowest for a lot of developing countries. And I'm not quite sure why that is, and we can maybe discuss why so many people remain very wed and very much committed to living agricultural livelihoods. So climate change has a number of impacts on agriculture. We're going to look at heat waves and drought. Obviously, floods could be included in extreme events, but these are the two that we're looking at. The research is basically not expecting long-term permanent migration, but rather because of strong local ties, and I've heard this from a number of you, there are very strong local ties, and so at most men, maybe women in some cases, will go to the city, stay for a period of time, and then return at some point to their home village. So this is, I don't know about this exclusionary urbanization argument, but there may be, I guess basically the fundamental element is that it's too expensive to live in cities long term. So people retain their roots in the rural areas. If you look at this aggregate crude migration intensity index that's calculated for different countries, guess which country is at the very bottom? It happens to be India. And some people may not be able to see the screen. So that means migration rates, internal migration rates in India are typically a little bit lower than they are in some other countries. So because there's an absence of local work opportunities outside of agriculture, we find this circular labor migration serves the needs of households best. Gender dynamics in migration, social and cultural norms restricting women's mobility means that migration is usually undertaken by men. Migrants reside and work away from their village most of the calendar year, typically 9 to 11 months, returning only briefly for major festivals, weddings, or other family obligations. And then those families in the home village receive remittances from their loved ones. This circularity of labor migration is often overlooked in climate migration research. So this is something that one or two of you brought up with me, that this is a particularity of India and would it be worthy of study? And the answer categorically is yes, it's an important phenomenon. but it's difficult to model because of the data difficulties in capturing. Remember I told you about the fact that if you have a census at a certain time and you capture people at a certain time, you're not capturing necessarily, if you ask where you were 5 years before, what about all those 4 or 5 years between that earlier time step when you might have moved as well? So how can we understand, how can we develop models that deepen the understanding of the relationship between climate change and human migration in India? And the answer is primarily through the tool of using agricultural labor force participation. And the assumption here is that if you are registered in a village and that's where you're counted, and that's the case in India from what I understand, even if you reside temporarily in an urban area, you would be counted in your home village by the census. If you are registered as non-agricultural and there's no other real opportunities to work in the non-agricultural sector, like there's a limited service and there's a limited industrial sector in that rural area, then if you say that you're not working in the agricultural sector, by implication, you could say that person has probably moved to a nearby urban area or even maybe to the capital, like to New Delhi. So that's the implication. What we had was data on labor force participation for 2001 and 2011. The new census is not yet published, but will be published soon, and we hope to update this analysis using data from the 2011 census. So we had these data for villages, and we linked it to a spatial database, the place, location, name, code. And then we had some data on irrigation, on percent of ag land irrigated, and crop data. And then finally we brought in biophysical data on drought. Okay, so this is the linking of social vulnerability or social data to climate data. And we have monthly drought data for every individual village for 40 years. We have Indian censuses recorded in 2001 and 11, which I told you about. We then use a fixed effects model with 5-year time lags for our regression analyses. The question is, was there drought in the village right before the census recorded? We do that for both 2001 and 2011 census years. We model the share of male unemployment in agriculture as a dependent variable because, as I said before, if you're working in the non-agricultural sector, that means most likely that you're moving out of the village and you're temporarily in a city for a period of time. So therefore, we bypass some of the problems that I mentioned, that you all are aware of in getting accurate data on migration. So this is the percent change in 2001 to 2011 in the agricultural workforce participation. And you can see the darker red areas is perhaps a 25% change in agricultural labor force participation. This is male workforce, not female workforce. Then what you can do is look at, you can drill down. I believe this is somewhere on the border between UP and Bihar. And you can look at the village level data and see some of the villages that have particularly high levels of out-migration. Then you can couple that with the drought index data. Most of you now are familiar with some of these terms, the SPEI, and the higher the number, so if it's higher the negative number, the more drought you see. And so the area that you're looking at in the Ganges Basin is generally drought prone. And this is a 2009 drought index. Normal conditions would be indicated by 0 or between the yellow and the orange areas. And we looked at different levels of drought: moderate drought, extreme drought, and exceptional drought. Right in here, you don't see any exceptional drought in this map, so that is not an issue. And this is the same area as I highlighted earlier on the border between UP and Bihar. So what you see basically, and this is part of the major take home of the findings, is that for drought and for severe drought, villages that were exposed to these drought levels actually saw higher levels of out-migration. So if you're below the line And you see a drought is green and severe drought is an orange. And if you're below the line, basically, um, uh, you're basically seeing the uh, this is for the whole population, meaning both male and female. You're seeing a negative 1% change in agricultural labor force participation in these two different cases, between 1 and 1.2% negative. Over a 5-year average on the right-hand side, you can see the effect is somewhat attenuated. So we're looking at 5 years of drought data. The average drought 5 years before the census, and you can see it's attenuated somewhat, but there is still a negative and statistically significant impact of drought. Here's some of the maps. So the map on the left is the 1-year lag, and the other is the 5-year average lag, average drought conditions. Gujarat is particularly sensitive, but then if you move westerly, you see that both UP and Bihar are also quite impacted. This is the projections. So we also did projections of SPEI based on different RCP scenarios. 2.45, which is, I'm sorry, 4.5. Yeah, and 8.5. So 4.5 is a moderate climate change scenario, and 8.5 would be the extreme climate change scenario. You can see at the bottom it says there's a change in 1.2, an increase in more than 1.2 severe drought months, and more than 1.6 severe drought months. I think that's in an average year, 5-year averages. So what you're seeing here is on the left, the 1-year lagged effect. If the same relationships, this is the ceteris paribus assumption, if the same relationship holds in the future, given a certain increase in drought, you would see it up to 2%, or even at the high end, a 3% decline in agricultural labor force participation. And if for the same thing for 5 years, 5-year droughts, you would see under a high emission scenario on the right-hand side, you would see, I'm just looking at the different scenarios that are mapped here. Anyway, you would see maybe a 4 to 5% decrease in agricultural labor force participation in the in a sort of a decadal period. So what are the implications and weaknesses of the studies? If the results are correct, then we would expect to see more movement from rural areas to cities under increased drought conditions in the future. Yet, why would we observe these findings? This approach says nothing about the individual or household level aspirations that people have. Are things like land fragmentation, changing aspirations, economic opportunities, mechanization also going to have an effect? Also, importantly, who migrates? Is it scheduled tribes and castes? Is it other backward classes? And who does not migrate? This is where quantitative models are limited in their ability to respond to the questions in a data-scarce environment. So that's why you need to go to the field. And so we're planning to go to the field in January 2026. I should actually be back in India at that time. And we'll be doing 2,000 to 3,000 household surveys across UP and Bihar. We want a better understanding also of how crop insurance policies, guaranteed wage labor, caste dynamics, and also more anthropological understanding of migration dynamics. And these are just some photos of the areas where Robin Van Dyne has conducted research in the past. Many of you will be very familiar with such scenes. So maybe I'll stop there and see if there's any immediate questions related to this research before I go on to talk more about policy options for climate mobility. So I guess if you just raise your hand and unmute, you can.
Okay. Dr. Alex, I have a question in my mind. Okay, how can the rural skill development and employment guarantee scheme reduce climate-induced displacements? What is your opinion?
Well, the idea would be if you have social protection measures or insurance schemes that if you lose your crops to a drought event, that you would be able to withstand that, over, if it were just a year or so, maybe 2 years at most, you might be able to withstand and stay in place, and rather than having to migrate. Those are the hypothesized relationships. At a very minimum, even if men are still going to migrate out of the village to go to the cities, you would hope for a higher standard of living, less impacts on the local population, maybe higher, less undernutrition among children, that sort of thing. So these are some of the impacts that those kinds of policies would have. And I'm happy to hear more. I mean, you guys are the experts. So if there's elements of this work that you don't agree with, and you say, well, that just doesn't make any sense, I will say that the data were analyzed in a rigorous manner. So I don't think we can dispute the data, but we could dispute the mechanisms at work. And my understanding is, though it's not explicit here, that some of these things like access to agriculture, to irrigated agriculture, and I forget what the other variable was that was included. Some of these things are already included in the models, so they would be controlled for. And so any additional migration is a result of basically what we hypothesize to be drought impacts. Yes, hand up. Go ahead.
Professor, in Bihar, I mean, the amount of land, I mean, are we only talking about the people working on others' land, or are we talking about them? Because there needs to be a survey around, okay, if the people who are migrating actually have a land or not. Or are there, like, I mean, I don't know if there is data around that. Because
Yes, so landlessness I know is a big issue, and I imagine I need to look at the survey that's been constructed, and I will be looking at it. Part of the reason I didn't get involved so much in the design of the field study is, A, Robin knows a lot about it already, and he would ask those kinds of questions. But secondly, I only recently came on as the PI, or the principal investigator of the project, as I said, because we lost the person who's conducting the work. So I'm going to be looking carefully at the instrument to make sure that things like landlessness are covered.
Sir, I have answer for this.
Okay, do you want to unmute over here? Just lean over. You have to lean
we
forward.
have that data in census. So if you go to the village census, in village census, there at the end column, you will find that agricultural laborer, cultivators, these types of classifications are there, and you can get the who are the owner of the farmer and who are the agricultural laborer. What you are pointing out, those are the agricultural laborer who don't have the land. So then with that data they can incorporate in their.
One observation what I would like to think of, or probably we can think of in a sense that which is very scant in terms of looking like the climate migration. For the last 5 years, we have gone through like a number of things, but possibly one thing that is the intersectional inequities, like which intersects with each other. For example, in UP and Bihar, like when you talks about the caste, for example, OBC, scheduled caste, or the scheduled tribes, for example, possibly there could not be a direct migration because of climate change. That could be a possibility, but the sort of indignity that climate change actually brings to them. For example, the common tap water, if it's some in rural areas, they would not be allowed to get from there. Like, what sort of, in terms of measuring that, what could be the possibilities that we can think of or develop? I think census doesn't offer that sort of thing also.
This is precisely the kind of input that we need, right? Thinking about these intersectional disadvantages that people have. So feel free to email me or contact me if you have additional thoughts. But make a note of those as well. And I think the survey is going to have to make up for some gaps, and of course the census has some variables that we'll be also exploiting. I do hope that the 2021 census is released soon, because it would be really no. You're,
It has not started yet. They have not started the enumeration.
oh, it was delayed because of COVID. Oh, so it was delayed because of COVID, I assume. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll be waiting for a little while then. Yeah. No, I well understand that.
Sir, I have a question. My point is that more generic, basically. So why this two state is taken into consideration for this project, while the drought has been found in the southern part and as well as in the district in the eastern part. Is there any specific cause of uh,
Well, the drought actually, according to the data that we have for SPI in that particular time period, doesn't show drought in southern India. But yes, you're right. Gujarat, and what is the state just below Bihar? I forget the name. Okay, thanks. So those two states would be primary, I guess, in terms of being most impacted during this time period, again, qualifying. But what I would say that some of this is just opportunistic. You know, we're international researchers. Getting in and out of remote regions of India may be more difficult. So I believe some of the rationale is you can get into New Delhi by flight directly from somewhere else and then go to the field almost immediately and start working. And that's part of the rationale. It's not a good rationale.
now the point is that I like to bring in the talk we had before lunch, because both these states, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, has a legacy of migration, and this is very much related with autocorrelation spatial. So if you look into that part and if you consider other states, yes, this one, if you look into the southern part as well as some of the part in West Bengal, some districts where the heterogeneity of migration is there, even though the drought is prevailing.
No, it's a good point. So we should be looking in places where migration is not increasing as a result of drought, is what you're saying. Okay, I get it. And I'll bring that back to the team. Yeah, no, I mean, this does show that there are parts of India where rates of rural to urban migration are very low, right? In Kerala and I don't know all the, what's the state in the Maharashtra? Maharashtra. So, you know, it's kind of, you know, striking. And as you point out, we're looking at a hotbed where there's a lot of migration to urban areas, and maybe we should be doing one control case. I'll bring that back. Anything else? I think maybe we should move on. We do want to have, oh, I see one more hand. Yes, of course.
Thanks, sir, for your such a good presentation. So I have 2 points. One point I have to make, like my fellow colleague said, that why we have taken the state of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So I'm also wondering, there's a lot of migration from upper land to the lower land. There's a state of Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand. My one of the fellow colleague is also from that state. He can tell you what, there is a lot of migration from that upper land due to the landslide, flash flood, and a lot of things are going on over there. So there's a lot of migration from that due to my disaster. So the second point, this I do not have to make a point. I just have to ask a clarification. What are the key takeaway points that we take from this presentation? So what are the conclusion that we can make at?
Well, the conclusion I stated earlier is basically that there is a sensitivity of particularly male agricultural labor force participation related to drought, from which we can infer that some of those men, most of them probably, are leaving the rural sector and going to the urban sector to work for a period. Is that clear enough?
Yeah, this is clear. I'm agreeing with your point. The first point is that there's a lot of migration from upper land to the lower land. So what we can do for that?
I don't know what upper and lower lands are.
Upper land is a Himalaya and lower land is a fertile land. So it is
Okay.
a Himachal Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, mountainous region.
Okay.
And there's a lowland is a terrain region, is a flat region.
Yeah, I don't think we look at that explicitly in this study, but if you're interested in looking at that, we can slice and dice these data any number of ways. One of the beauties that hopefully you're learning from this workshop is once you have the data in a spatial framework, like I showed earlier when we did the climate mobility modeling for the World Bank, we looked at livelihood zones, but we could have looked, we did for ACMI, we looked at What was the migration in and out of urban areas? What was the migration in and out of climate migration in and out of borderland areas, because they wanted to know about borderlands, pastoral lands, etc. And once you have the data in a spatial framework, it's easy to do all those kinds of tests. So you guys are giving us some really good ideas. I'm actually going to point my collaborators to this video afterwards and ask them to listen to it carefully. And feel free to email me as well. All right. Can we go on, or shall we? Okay, no problem. I have no problem talking about this longer if you'd like. Um, all right. So now we're going to talk a bit about policy responses with some colleagues. So this is some of the policy responses that we've looked at in our center and colleagues of mine have looked at. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of these possible responses. So in this paper with Sarah Rosengartner, who is a close collaborator from the Global Center on Climate Mobility, we looked at how development actors, the World Bank, USAID, you have a hand up? The development actors look at how they have been addressing the question of climate mobility. And frankly, there's not a lot of evidence to show that they've been doing a lot in this area, but there is a study that the World Bank conducted after groundswell, led by Kanta Kumari Rago, and that study is available, and you can look at what the World Bank has invested in. What we did is we took data from a database that was hosted by William and Mary College in the United States, and I'm trying to remember the name of the database, but it's a database that basically catalogs all development projects globally, as many as they can get data on. The magnitude of investment, location of the investment, et cetera. So we filtered that database for anything to do with migration, and we looked at impacts of, whether they were projects that looked at climate mobility or not. So the 5 types of responses that we found were adaptation in place, so basically trying to build resilience in the locality where people are leaving. Facilitating mobility is an integral part of climate adaptation. Frankly, a lot of governments there's what we call a sedentary bias in governments generally. Sedentary bias means that we like people to stay where they are. We're not all that fond about, people moving to urban areas. We don't care too much if they move between villages and rural areas, but, let's try to keep them in the rural areas. And so there's not a lot of facilitated migration going on where governments are actually actively supporting migrants. But there's also efforts to do planned relocation and resettlement. I'll talk more about that towards the end of my presentation. And then there's managing displacement impacts. So, for instance, the EU has funded certain countries to be refugee hosting countries. They basically say, if you can, house and feed and provide water and maybe some health services to these populations that are displaced into your country, we'll support you with additional foreign aid. So there's other ways that managing displacement impacts also takes place. In the second category, there's a group called Mercy Aid, Mercy Care. And Mercy Care basically came up with an innovative project that I heard of in Niger, where they help facilitate the education of migrants leaving Niger to go to Nigeria. So what happens in many countries is if you go to a neighboring country, you're not protected by law, you're considered a foreigner, and you're easily exploited. And so what they've done is actually help train the young men, particularly who go to Nigeria from Niger, which is just to the north, to better negotiate and to better take care of themselves, essentially. And they did it as a test, a pilot test, where they basically trained some young people, and they didn't do it for others, and they were using it as a controlled experiment. And I don't actually have the final results of that, but I thought it was a very innovative idea to just give a little bit of extra information and capacity for migrants to do a better job when they migrate. And in achieving their objectives. Ultimately, what they're trying to do is earn money. Here's some areas of work that Sarah Rosengartner, who I mentioned earlier at GCCM, has, these are areas that policy and programming can help with. It can prevent people from migrating by helping them stay in place. It can facilitate, like I mentioned, can protect the rights of people to move, and it can include people, meaning if people move to an area, there could be policies in place where they're not rejected outright or ignored, but they're actually assisted when they get to their destination. In each of these particular areas of, there's different areas of climate action, and so different groups would be responsible for different kinds of interventions. An increasingly important area that people are looking at is how cities can become more welcoming, like climate refuges, if it were, as it were. And so they're demanding, decision makers, mayors are demanding more localized data and projections. They want decision-making power over key policy levers such as land use and planning and taxation. Helping to know who's coming in is important. Involvement in policy making at higher levels of governance, and direct access to funding and financing. So these are things that mayors are now increasingly demanding. I've worked a little bit with this group called Mayor's Migration Council. We've actually developed on the left-hand side some projections for them of future climate migration into cities in Central America and Mexico. And you can see some of the areas that are urbanized where you'll see a high certainty of high levels of climate in migration, and those are the red and the yellow areas. And so, Mexico City, Guadalajara, Managua, almost every city has red, meaning that they're likely to see more climate migration in the future. This is some maps we did for the ACMI, looking at Cairo, and looking at, in the future, we have data down to a 1 kilometer level showing where there might be future climate migration. But mayors are looking for more refined information. On Wednesday, I went to the NIAU, and NIAU is National Institute for Urban Affairs, NIUA, sorry. They were very interested in this potential for rural to urban migration to result in more, single men who need temporary housing when they're. And one of the phenomena they described happening, which is something that local mayors and policymakers don't particularly like, is that landowners, maybe in villages just outside in the urban periphery, are dividing up their land and building residences for these men, and sometimes 4 men will share one room, and they'll even rotate the beds. So there's some working, at night, some working in the day, and so they can really make a handy profit off of this quickly. But this is not a legal form of land use, and the landlords are aware of that, so they try to keep it down low. They don't want the policymakers to be aware. But it's an interesting phenomenon, and something that obviously, if there's more migration in the future to the cities or temporary labor migration, that kind of phenomena will grow in importance. And part of the reason it's on the down low is these people are not paying taxes on those properties, and they're building up land in ways that may not be according to urban development standards. So I mentioned the GCCM before. They've done a lot of work in different parts of the world. We worked in Africa with them, and we're working in the Caribbean. But recently, after the Africa work that we did, they went back to a number of countries. I believe it was Uganda and Angola. No, not Angola. Namibia and maybe Botswana and maybe 1 or 2 other countries, to actually work with local authorities on planning for climate migration. Their action agenda is here, and maybe we can bring that back up when we talk about policy options for India. But these are some of the things that they want to do, like amplify women's agency, the ability of women to act. They want to harness the ambitions of the youth. So youth can be problematic when they don't achieve their aspirations. We say busy, idle hands are the devil's playground, we say in American English. That means when you're not doing anything, you get into trouble. And it's better to get busy. So how can we harness the ambitions of the youth? And building from the local, all these things are really like maybe common sense at one level, but they are important rubrics for action. So what they've done in Africa is they've done things like this deep dive in Uganda. They start by localizing the continental knowledge, the knowledge that we generated with our modeling work, and which was also informed by some of the surveys they conducted in northern Uganda and Karamoja. And then they develop policy blueprints addressing climate mobility and inform adaptation and development planning. The overall process is to take the data and the desk research and the research studies that have been done in a country, do consultations with national stakeholders, and then develop a blueprint for action in the country. And these are some changes in Uganda for temperature, the anomalies, and you can see, like the charts I showed on day one, everything's pointing upwards in terms of temperatures in Uganda in reference to the 30-year baseline period. There's a lot of displacement, affected populations, there's deaths from disasters, and there's also differences by region on how literate people are about climate issues. So, I mean, one thing that may sound simple, but if people don't even know that there's climate risks to begin with, they're not aware that building in a certain area, even though today it may be dry, in 2 months when the monsoon comes, it's up to 10 feet in water. You need to educate people, but there's also, this is just basic literacy, like, do you even know that climate change is happening? And so these are some of the rates in parts of Uganda. So we took data that we actually, Fabien Courtier produced on bilateral flows between countries in Africa. So this was using climate model projections and identifying the sensitivity in the past of bilateral flows to climate of migration between countries and climate parameters. And then we use those same sensitivity factors to project into the future under different climate scenarios. So what we see is that Uganda is mainly a net sending country, with a lot of people going to Kenya and Rwanda on the right-hand side. But it also receives a certain number of migrants from Tanzania, Sudan, Congo, Burundi, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, etc. So just to give you an idea of the sort of international migration picture for Uganda, one of the things in Africa is a lot of East Africa and West Africa both have free movement agreements. So you can actually move between countries without visas, and you can even work in neighboring countries without visas. This is similar to what I showed you for Senegal this morning, and it just shows the likely future internal climate migration levels in Uganda out to 2050, with a kind of high end of 5.1 and a low end of 2.2 million. And this also, with the same data that I showed you earlier, you can just calculate other internal migrants, non-climate migrants. So you get an idea of how climate mobility compares to non-climate mobility. Then you can look at origins and destination areas in sort of the probability of certain areas being origin and destination. I'm not certain, but I think this is where Kampala is. And I believe this is Lake Victoria here, the southern border. So you can see on the right-hand side the numbers, projected numbers of people by 2050, the kind of cumulated net migration from 2010 to 2050. And the green areas would leave people, the green areas are people arriving in new areas, and the red areas are people leaving in this particular in this particular map. And this is just climate migration, so this is not speaking on the right-hand side about other forms of mobility. We know that there'll be a lot of in-migration to Kampala no matter what, just because Kampala is a magnet for migrants. And then we can look at cities that are growing or declining under climate scenarios. So the process was we mapped out the mapping of the outreach to stakeholders. They had 5 workshops, and then they documented the findings from those workshops, the stakeholder consultations. Out of those workshops, people had the following observations, and these are observations from the local participants, that people experience changes to weather and environment but don't know about climate change. So they know about extremes, but they don't know that climate change may be behind those. There is a lack of climate risk education. Climate stressors put strain on gender relations and mental and physical health. Poor environmental practices exacerbate the impacts of climate change. So, doing things that affect the environment in ways that exacerbate flood, for instance. People move when climate impacts threaten their water access, livelihoods, and food security. Movements can lead to conflict between farmers and herders. This is a common theme in Africa. People tolerate climate-related risks in order to preserve access to their fertile land. So this might be the India kind of phenomena, where even though there's risks, I'd rather stay on the land than leave the land, because if I leave the land, someone else is likely to take the land that I have. And then migrants and displaced peoples often settle in places that are more vulnerable or more at risk to climate hazards. And then they had this blueprint. They want to enable people to stay where they are. They want to provide informed mobility and create enabling conditions for safe settlement and inclusion of newcomers. So those are some, that's an example of what might be done and could be done potentially in a country like India, as vast as India. And then they have a kind of a more granular blueprint, and maybe we can come back to a few of these slides when we have a discussion later about different approaches. All right, so let's quickly, because I'm gonna run out of time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for discussion. Talk about managed retreat as a policy option. This is a dialogue that's really happening primarily in the U.S. I don't know if managed retreat is even a term that's used in India. Have you heard of the term? Has it been used, to your knowledge, within India? No? Yes? Nobody's, I don't see too many people nodding. So in the U.S., it's a term that's being used as climate extremes become more intense and people are losing their homes. And so it's becoming a debate about, houses being burned down or houses being flooded out, maybe multiple times in a 10-year period where floods come routinely. And what do we do in response to that? There's also problems with insurance in the U.S. So homes are a really important asset in America. So the way people build wealth in America is to own a home to begin with. And then hopefully over time that value appreciates and you can upgrade to a larger home, etc. And if you lose your home, that's a very big issue. Not only because you've lost your dwelling, but because your single biggest asset, your home, has been destroyed. And if insurers pull out of certain markets, that ability to replace a home, to rebuild it, is lost, right? So here's just some examples. We usually speak about managed retreat in the context of flood risk in the coastal zone, storm surge, cyclones, and of course long-term sea level rise. This just shows a map of areas in the world where sea level rise is most pronounced. In those areas where it's going to get highest by 2100 are in red. So, it's not just about global sea level rise. There's a lot of local characteristics that result in differential sea level rise based on whether your land is subsiding or sinking, or if it's rising owing to plate tectonics, and also things like eustatic sea level rise, which is due to the ocean's heating. So there's actually areas of the Pacific that are a lot higher than other parts of the Pacific because the ocean is just that much warmer in the middle of the Pacific in parts of the tropical Pacific. The water actually expands, the molecules expand. So that's part of sea level rise. So just to say that that's why the circles aren't the same size everywhere in the world, because sea level rise will be differential. What's happening in some parts of America are things like this in Pacifica, California, where they have built houses high up on cliffs, and those cliffs are being eroded at the base. So houses, apartments are literally falling off into the sea. You see this house, that could be overnight, a major coastal storm, and suddenly you wake up and your lawn is gone and your house is kind of like hanging out over the cliff. So they've been debating how to handle this. This is a great podcast if you want to listen to it later. But basically, what it brings up is the fact that people don't want to move even if they're told that they're at risk. And so people like that seafront view is still valuable to a lot of people, even though they're hanging on the edge of the cliff, believe it or not. So this is an issue that is becoming very controversial in America. Miami is another situation, a very low-lying area where flooding occurs on a pretty routine basis. It's not just sea level rise. It's like you get a massive rainfall and you got floods. So this is the kind of issue they're facing. And of course, there is also something called blue sky flooding from sea level, where the water just comes up through the storm drains and it floods the streets. That's salt water, by the way, so you don't want to be driving through that water. That's like really bad for your car, just in case you're ever wondering. So this is Miami, and these are some of the flood depths that occur. This is a 100-year event according to FEMA, and it shows where water would be waist. This is just like common people's parlance, right? Knee to waist deep, waist to head deep, etc. And so you can see large areas of Miami that would be under, like, this is 0 meters sea level rise. This is 2 meters sea level rise. And you can just see how much of the area is affected by sea level rise. So they asked, this is a colleague of mine, Nadia Satiram, former postdoc at Columbia, and she asked people if they're considering moving. She interviewed people who are residents of Miami, different parts of Miami, if they're considering moving in the next 5 years. About 47% in the interviews said yes, about 40% in the surveys said yes, but that could be for any number of reasons, and some of the major reasons tended to be around affordability and employment. Those are the major reasons. Flooding was around 20% of the population said they might move because of flooding. So these are kind of interesting findings. They're a little like reality checks about what people are thinking. Increased heat is also a factor in Miami, and people don't like it when it's really hot, like today is here. I've been doing some work in New York City, and this is a map of extreme flood risk. You see it's somewhat coarse resolution, but this is sea level rise by 2080 in New York City. So water will be going up streets by 2080 under an extreme flood with sea level rise. So that means that sea level rise is essentially blocking water from getting off the streets and into storm drains. So what I've done is gone down to a community called Red Hook, right down here in the Hudson, in the kind of New York City Bay. What do they call that area? Anyway, it's sort of the mouth of the Hudson River. And this is an area that was under sea level. So this is a high water mark during Sandy. And if I stood next to that mark, I would be underwater basically entirely. That was the level of water at the port facility. That's a model, so that's not the actual drone view of the community, but it's a model of what Sandy did to the community when the storm surge occurred in 2012. And So you can see water went inland and also preferentially went to areas that were already low-lying, which were part of the inland area. This is a guy, Tad Pulowski at Columbia, who introduced me to this community. And this is a community leader, Karen Blundell. And you know what's interesting? So they developed a plan to protect Red Hook, this community, with a 10-foot elevation. So that's about 2 meters, 3 meters, 3 meter elevation bund or dike or water kind of seawall, with some of those areas being existing 3 meter areas, and some of them being new proposed protections. After all these years, this thing was developed about 4 or 5 years ago. I haven't seen that come into place yet. All I've seen so far is temporary flood protection measures. But anyway, the long and short is that Karen, I asked her on my latest visit, and I said, hey, these are students, by the way, that we bring down there to talk about this topic. I said, yes, they're developing a lot of high rent, really luxury housing in the community of Red Hook, right on the water. And I was like, assuming she is a low income person living in public assisted housing would be opposed to this, but she's actually for it. Why do you think she might be for it? Why do you think she would actually support a bunch of gentrification, essentially, or new high rent units? Any thoughts? I think she's just being pragmatic. She knows that the community is likely to be better protected if you have a lot of wealthy people moving in. It's a reality, right? So if it's almost like an insurance policy. Well, those people are right on the water. They're going to be the first to, as we say in American English, they're going to be the first to squawk when there's a problem. They'll start crying out, "You got to do something to protect us. This isn't, right." And if it's just the low-income population in that community living in public assisted housing, the mayor will be all too easily say, "We just need to move you all out of here." So it's a kind of interesting strategy. These are some of the strategies, by the way, for southern Manhattan to make it flood-proof. Very expensive and very beautiful, but these things are going to cost billions and billions of dollars. And frankly, some of it's gotten underway, but a lot of it doesn't look anything like that today. But they would never do anything like that for Red Hook because it's a isolated community on the other side, not in southern Manhattan. This is where Wall Street is, by the way, just in the southern part of Manhattan. All right, so there's also a lot of other issues that might result in managed retreat, and so things like wildfires, drought, extreme heat might result in some people leaving certain areas, and finally tornado risk. Tornadoes are a big issue in America. Have you ever seen pictures after a tornado, what it looks like? I mean, I don't live in a tornado belt, although everywhere in America now has become a tornado belt. It's literally happening in New Jersey, Massachusetts, where I grew up, way up in the Northeast. We never had tornadoes, never even heard of tornadoes happening there. But now with climate change, we're seeing tornadoes occurring everywhere. But there's a certain area called Tornado Alley in middle of America. And frankly, that's one of the areas where insurers are pulling out the most. Because when a tornado comes through, nothing survives. There's nothing in its path. People survive, they go underground, but the building's completely obliterated. So these are some of the headlines that are occurring in the U.S. now about whether we're going to see more climate migration. I get interviewed periodically. I don't always, it's not always a welcome voice because I'm a little bit of a skeptic about some of this narrative again, but these are some future projections done by some colleagues that look at future potential migration out of the coastal zone and in America under certain climate scenarios. What are the basic policy responses in managed retreat? Managed retreat has to do with moving people, generally speaking, the term has to do with moving people out of areas affected by climate risks and moving settlements and removing settlements and rewilding areas. So in principle, managed retreat at its core is supposed to mean getting people out of there and then allowing nature to do its job of protecting the coastline. These are like nature-based solutions, if you will. But managed retreat has increasingly also been construed as things like accommodation strategies. So if you live in a flood-prone area, you could move your house, get your house on stilts, put everything, up about 10 or 15 feet and get it out of the water, the flood zone. It can also imply things like protection. Buyouts are a common strategy in managed retreat. So what you do is you go into the community and you basically start offering people money for their homes, and the government pays them. There's other strategies that have been tried, like rent to buy, sort of like people sell to the government and then they rent it back from the government until a catastrophe strikes. And then when the catastrophe happens, they can leave without losing their asset. They've already sold it. There's planned relocations, also zoning restriction, increased insurance rates. So there are a lot of different approaches that are being taken. Some of you read those stories from the Arctic, the indigenous people in the Arctic living up in Alaska. And that particular article relates to negotiated efforts by indigenous groups, Eskimo group, well, they're Native Alaskan groups, to move out of the coastal area because of the increasing risks they face. So there's a lot of controversy around managed retreat. Maybe I'll skip these slides because they have to do more with the controversies in America. But a lot of it just comes down to vested interests. And in particular for real estate companies, they don't like this at all because it means they're losing value, losing assets. And home builders don't like the idea of managed retreat either, because every time a disaster comes, who's employed the people who build homes and construction industry? They like it. They like those disasters because they bring new money in. So there's a lot of different vested interests, and largely the big issue, though, like in India, is that most people just don't want to leave their home. They don't want to leave where they consider to be their community. If you want to know more about Managed Retreat, every 2 years I've been organizing this conference called Managed Retreat. We changed the name to Mobility and Resilience this year to make it a bigger, broader discussion. But you can go to the URLs there to get YouTube videos. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll break there. I have some slides that I could show on resettlement issues. This was a paper that I wrote a few years ago with some colleagues, and where it was really the first effort to look at what might happen under climate change with the need to resettle populations. And so I can talk more about that if you'd like, but maybe we could stop there and just begin some of the conversation around what might be done in India and what might be some of the policy solutions and options in this country. So, Intesa, do you want to bring up the spreadsheet with the, thanks.
After that, we need to contact the for half an hour.
Yeah, so at 4:30 they can do the exam, correct? All right, I'm being told that we need to stop now for, I guess you all have an exam. And but we do have about 5 minutes, so maybe we can have some early discussion around possible policy options in India. By the way, the slides on resettlement are on the drive, so you can look at those slides. So you've been very patient. You paid attention. I appreciate it. You've been amazing. And we may not have an opportunity right now to get into all the options, the adaptation options that you described for the first tutorial on causal modeling, but I'm wondering if there are observations around policies that may have been tried already in India, may have succeeded or may not have succeeded to address issues around climate mobility, given the particularities of India and the particular policy and livelihood environment here.
Sir, in India, still there is no such a policy regarding climate mobility. But apart from that, there is a huge internal migration happening over the past decades in the country. To check that, in the early 2000, the government brought a concept called PURA, provision of urban amenities to rural areas. That was a concept to uh, accelerate or to energize the village areas for energize the local economy, but it failed later on. So as such, there is no such climate mobility, any policy regarding climate mobility, but there are some policies which are not working on the ground, but to check the migration, internal migration in the country.
So at the time when they tried this policy, was there actually were there examples where they did actually implement it? Were there some successes?
Yes, sir. They implemented some village areas which later they converted to smart village concept. Then some of the ministers and member of parliaments were assigned out on the whole country scale.
What I think perfectly work for the government, or when we see for the narrative of climate change, is like prioritizing the national security over the human security. That becomes one of the important concern, and it's like if you try to see the India, climate mobility is a concern definitely, but that is particularly to the national security. So if you look like the works of Gregory White, for example, the climate migration in the warming world, where he actually takes the example of transnational Atlantic, but he then again try to explain, for example, the Bangladesh and India relation, where one of the most important hotspot any of the academician working on climate migration pinpoint that this area is having the potential to project the violence in the future. And we see that there's a lot of identity crisis. And in terms of policy response, so whatever we try to see, it's not only Gregory White, but also I think Andrew Baldwin. In Reed Boas, you also talked on that. She also has a book on securitization of climate-induced migration. Then Timothy Doyle, Sanjay Chaturvedi. So whatsoever try to bring in perspective. So it's like let's leave alone that we understand, especially in terms of global south, that what is adaptation and mitigation to climate change. It is mostly about projecting as a sort of leader on the international politics to find a place. So moreover, it's like when you try to promise a net zero by 2070, but in 2025 you are heavily relying on the coal. How is that going to happen? And it's like if it's more like very classical thing, neo Malthusian thinking, and it's not only about India, particularly in the US. It's like I was just trying to drill out few of the important newspapers like New York Times or the Washington Post till 2014 to 2024. What I mostly find is the either it's lamented with the securitized perception or with the emergency issue. It's like I don't know. It's like how difficult it is, especially for the state in global south, to take the climate-induced migration as an important subject to and to juxtapose it with the adaptation strategy rather than lamenting it only in the national security issue.
I agree. Uh, we need to move beyond the securitization debate and ideally put in place policies that benefit those who are most at risk and most vulnerable to climate impacts. So I don't have a lot to contribute there. I think that what you're suggesting is that the same debate that's occurring on international levels between states is also occurring within countries, and that decision makers are making decisions based more on trying to preserve the privilege of the elite than they are on sharing wealth or expanding. So there is, I will say that in some countries, social protection mechanisms are being piloted and tested. I think in Ethiopia, they've had some social protection mechanisms. So the idea is that, if you fall below a certain level of well-being or food availability or whatever, there's some safety net there. And these are things that could ameliorate situations for many rural populations. Other observations?
We will have, sir.
Hello. Hello, Professor. It was a nice presentation. I have one question. Since Bihar is a critical case for development studies, and there are many research, especially I will talk about the foreign developed countries, professors or researchers who are doing collaborations with like Bihar and institutes in order to bring some development, because we all know Bihar lacks in in terms of employment, in terms of health, nutrition, vulnerability. So they are a critical case for development studies. But since a lot many research collaborations have been happening, but there is no ground impact being seen. Like I am from Bihar, and there is no ground impact being seen. So what are your thoughts on it?
So I had a conversation over lunch, and I think it was a very helpful one in which someone who's a participant here said, look, we developed the vulnerability maps, we identify where the vulnerability is, but then what? And this is often a problem, and I admit that I'm not contributing to a solution to that problem necessarily, because you may go off and generate your own vulnerability maps. Where I think that the challenge is for many academics, we're not well versed as practitioners in actually implementing changes on the ground. And partly it's we like a little bit the academic remove. We have a little protection mechanism. We study phenomena, but we're not too deeply involved in the phenomena. And I'm not saying every academic in this room. I can speak for myself mainly, in that I know that I enjoy studying the problem, but I don't always enjoy getting my hands dirty trying to come up with a solution. So it could be just a challenge to all of us to think about how the implications of our studies could actually make a difference and be implemented a change in the localities where we're working. That may mean forming longer term relationships with the populations that we're studying. So it's not just, oh, I just come in, I've done this one study, then I'm gone, and then you never see me again, but actually I'm doing this study over the long haul, and I'm actually going to walk with you, and I'm not going to be able to solve all your problems, but I may be an advocate for you when it comes to talking about to policymakers or to others some of the things that are needed in your locality. I don't know if any of you have been thinking about that or been challenged in that way. I've been challenged at my workplace because I live near Harlem, which is one of the poorest communities in New York, and we have some engagement with environmental justice groups in Harlem through my center, but I haven't necessarily personally been involved in like working with a community, trying to solve problems, figure out how to get access to the power and the money and the finance to actually change things on the ground. So it's a challenge to all of us basically to not just do our academic studies, but to actually move beyond that. I will say one thing, many of you young academics, you're trying to publish papers, you have a lot of pressure on you. I'm not trying to add another level of pressure. Partly the academic system itself, I've seen the pressure on some of you, so I've sort of seen the degree of pressure on you. the academic system itself, and this is changing a bit in the US, maybe it could change in India as well, needs to reward community engagement. If there's no reward for being involved with communities over the long haul, and all you're judged on is your teaching and your academic publication record, then in some ways academia is failing in its role to be a change agent in society. Our climate school is trying to push in that direction of rewarding people more for actual ground level impact. But I know there's a good fraction of my colleagues that are involved in that kind of thing, but it takes this special mindset and a special aptitude, capability to do that kind of work.
Professor, I actually worked like field. I did my field work for 3 months basically with one of the US professor from Georgia Tech. So when I went to the field, I found it that we were trying to do our work, like we were interviewing them, we were like taking their time, but the problems that they were suffering and no solution was provided to them. They were like so distressed. So it felt like we are just trying to mint like money, just using their poverty and unemployment and all things. So
Yep, it's a classic problem. You're bringing up a very important point, and that is that we tend to be extractive when we do our research. And people are left, their time has been taken. My principle, anyway, is if you take people's time, you should compensate them for the time they gave to answering your survey. That's a minimum. That's just like the minimum. And so, if you have to build a budget that basically accommodates giving everybody, what is it, equivalent of, in the Indian context, maybe it would be equivalent of $2 to $3 or something that might make a difference for them in some way materially. I don't know if that's the right level. When we were going to go to the Gambia in Africa, we were going to give people $5 for participating. So just to say that that's something that maybe people should consider here.
Okay, we will have we will first have the test, and after that I think we will have enough time to discuss more things too, because after the test we have to wait for the validating function for till 6, so we can discuss a lot of things. We have some till 5, sorry, till 5, so more much we have half an hour, so we can discuss about that. Okay, so the Google Form link will be shared to the WhatsApp group, as well as the scanner also. When QR scanning code will also be shared, and we all will